Welcome to Whispers After Midnight. Tonight we step into a place the maps never warned you about, where hospitality masked horror and travelers vanished without a scream. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe because every story here is built on long hours of digging through real records, court files, and forgotten testimonies to bring you the most accurate, true accounts possible. Now dim the lights and listen closely. The isolated Ozark homestead didn't look like a place where nightmares were made. It looked like safety, tucked deep into the rolling hills and dense forests of the Ozarks, far from crowded towns and paved roads. The house sat along a narrow travel route used by traders, drifters, and families moving west. To wary travelers, it appeared almost merciful. After days of mud, rain, hunger, and uncertainty, the sight of a solid wooden house with smoke curling gently from its chimney felt like salvation. The family who lived there understood this psychology perfectly. They knew exhaustion lowers suspicion. They knew isolation breeds dependence. And they knew that anyone who knocked on their door had very few alternatives. The Ozarks at the time were a maze of thick woods, steep ravines, and poorly marked trails. Maps were unreliable, and asking for directions often meant trusting strangers. This homestead stood at a crossroads of sorts, not a marked intersection, but a point where paths converged naturally due to terrain. Travelers didn't come there by accident. The land funneled them in. The family used this to their advantage, presenting themselves as generous mountain folk who believed in old-fashioned hospitality. A warm meal, a dry bed, a place to rest horses, everything a traveler prayed for at night. What made the house especially disarming was how ordinary it seemed. No broken fences, no threatening dogs, no signs of decay. The porch was swept clean. The windows glowed softly after dark. Even the voices inside sounded normal. Laughter, conversation, the clatter of dishes. It felt lived in, loved in. This was not a haunted ruin, it was a home. And that was precisely the danger. Evil didn't announce itself here. It blended in, wore a friendly smile, and offered supper. The remoteness worked like a shield. Neighbors were miles away, sometimes a full day's walk. Screams would vanish into the forest. Gunshots could be dismissed as hunting. Wagons coming and going were common enough that no single arrival or failure to depart raised alarm. In the Ozarks, people minded their own business, not out of indifference, but survival. The land taught you to keep to yourself. The family relied on that unspoken rule. Inside the house, the layout appeared simple, almost cramped, but it was designed with intention. Hallways felt slightly too narrow. Doors were placed where you didn't expect them. Some rooms felt colder than others, even near the hearth. Travelers noticed these things only in hindsight, if they noticed them at all. At the time, fatigue dulled their instincts. A bed mattered more than questions. The homestead became known quietly among travelers as a good stopping place. Word spread the way it always did back then, by campfire talk and trail gossip. "There's a family up ahead," someone would say. "They won't turn you away." That reputation was the family's greatest weapon. Each new visitor arrived already trusting them, already grateful, already convinced they were safe. And that is what made the House of Death so effective. It wasn't hidden. It didn't need to be. It stood openly in the Ozarks, offering shelter in a hostile land, using kindness as bait. The isolation wasn't just geographical, it was psychological. Once you stepped onto that porch, you were alone in a way that had nothing to do with distance, and everything to do with who controlled the ground beneath your feet. The family itself was the true engine behind the horror, a tight-knit unit bound not just by blood, but by silence, routine, and shared guilt. Outsiders saw a hard-working Ozark family surviving the harsh land together. But inside those walls existed an unspoken agreement. No one talked, no one questioned, and no one showed weakness. Each member had a role, and each role supported the same dark purpose. This was not chaos or impulsive violence. It was organized, practiced, and passed down like a grim inheritance. At the center stood the authority figure, calm, controlled, and outwardly respectable. This person spoke for the family, greeted travelers, and decided who stayed the night. Their voice carried reassurance, the kind that settled nerves and made people lower their guard. But authority in this house was absolute. When a decision was made, it was obeyed without discussion. Fear didn't rule this family, conditioning did. Years of shared secrecy had erased the line between right and wrong. Other members played subtler parts. One handled the domestic side, meals, bedding, conversation, creating a sense of normalcy that made guests feel like part of the household. Another observed quietly, watching habits, counting belongings, noting who asked too many questions. Even the younger members were not innocent bystanders. They were raised in this environment, taught early what not to ask, what not to see, and how to stay quiet when strangers were present. Silence was survival. Obedience was love. What made the family especially dangerous was how united they appeared. There were no public arguments, no visible cracks. Neighbors, when they did encounter them, described them as reserved but polite, religious even. This outward image acted as armor. In isolated communities, families like this blended in easily. People assumed harshness was just mountain life, that odd behavior came from isolation rather than malice. The family relied on that assumption. Inside the home, communication often happened without words. A glance, applause, a change in tone, signals learned over years. By the time a traveler sensed something was wrong, the decision had already been made. Resistance was rare, not because victims were weak, but because the family moved as one. Confusion was part of the trap. Victims couldn't tell who to trust, because trust didn't exist inside those walls at all. Perhaps the most chilling aspect was that none of them saw themselves as monsters. In their own minds, they were doing what was necessary, protecting the family, preserving their way of life, taking advantage of opportunities the world foolishly handed them. Over time, repetition numbed conscience. What began as secrecy hardened into routine. Routine turned into tradition. This was not the story of one killer dragging others along. It was a collective descent. Every member became complicit, whether through action or silence. And once a family crosses that line together, turning back becomes almost impossible, because confession wouldn't just destroy one life, it would erase them all. The road that led past the Ozark homestead was never meant to be permanent. It was a traveler's road, a living thing shaped by wagon wheels, horse hooves, and desperate footsteps. It wound through dense timber and uneven ground, skirting ravines and creeks that swelled without warning. For those heading west or south, it was less a choice and more a necessity. Detours could cost days, even lives. And along this stretch, the family's house sat like a final checkpoint between exhaustion and hope. Most travelers reached this road at their weakest moment. Supplies ran low here. Horses tired. Weather turned suddenly. Nights came fast under the Ozark canopy, swallowing light and sound alike. Campfires were risky. Smoke carried, and wildlife roamed freely. So when a structure appeared ahead, solid and lit, it felt like a promise the road itself was making. The house became part of the route's unspoken logic. You endure the worst stretch, and you're rewarded with rest. But this road didn't just bring people in, it kept them from leaving. Once past the homestead, the terrain grew harsher, trails less defined. Travelers often planned their journey around stopping there, believing they'd regain strength before pushing on. That decision trapped them in a narrow window of vulnerability. Staying meant surrendering control. Leaving late meant navigating dangerous ground in darkness. Either way, the road stopped being a path forward and became a funnel. What made the disappearances so difficult to trace was the nature of travel itself at the time. People moved alone or in small groups. They didn't file plans. They didn't check in. If someone failed to arrive at their destination, the road was blamed. Wagons broke. Rivers flooded. Illness struck. The Ozarks swallowed explanations easily. The family counted on that uncertainty. Each vanished traveler became just another story the road erased. Those who passed through nearby towns often mentioned the homestead casually. "We stayed up the ridge," they'd say, "caned folks." That single sentence cemented the house's place on the road as safe, even recommended. Over time, the road and the house became linked in the minds of travelers. You couldn't think of one without the other. That association was deadly. At night, the road was especially unforgiving. Sounds carried strangely, footsteps echoing where no one stood, branches snapping without cause. Travelers arriving after dark were already on edge, their instincts dulled by fear and fatigue. The family used timing to their advantage, encouraging late arrivals to stay rather than risk the trail. The road didn't just deliver victims, it pressured them into compliance, and so the traveler's road earned a darker reputation long after the truth emerged. Not because it was cursed, but because it led people to believe they were almost safe. That illusion, crafted by geography, desperation, and human trust, turned a simple route through the Ozarks into a dead end. For 11 travelers, the road didn't carry them forward at all. It carried them straight into silence. At first, no one noticed a pattern because there wasn't supposed to be one. People vanished all the time in the Ozarks. A man heading west might never be heard from again. A family could reroute, settle elsewhere, or die quietly along the trail. Disappearance was an accepted risk of travel. That assumption protected the family longer than any locked door ever could. The 11 travelers did not vanish together. They arrived weeks apart, sometimes months, different ages, different backgrounds. Some alone, others in pairs. A trader carrying goods, a young couple chasing land rumors, a drifter following seasonal work. Each disappearance looked isolated, explainable, forgettable. No blood on the road, no abandoned wagons clustered in one place. Just absence. What made it worse was that most of them were outsiders. They didn't belong to nearby towns. No one knew their full names. Some were known only by first names or nicknames shared around campfires. When they failed to arrive at their destinations, families assumed delays, then accidents, then the long, quiet fear that settled when months passed with no word. By then, the trail had already erased them. The family understood this perfectly. They spaced their actions carefully, never drawing attention through repetition. They let time do the hiding. Each traveler was absorbed into the silence of the Ozarks, one by one, like stones dropped into deep water. No ripples reached the surface. Occasionally, questions surfaced. A brother would arrive looking for someone. A merchant would ask why a shipment never came through. Local lawmen made notes, not connections. The answers were always the same: storms, bandits, illness, bad luck. The Ozarks offered too many believable explanations. Suspicion never settled in one place long enough to harden into certainty. What finally made the disappearances unsettling wasn't the number, it was the similarity. All had last been seen traveling the same route. All had spoken of stopping at the same homestead. Individually, that meant nothing. together meant everything. But it took years for those fragments to align, years for whispers to turn into uneasy comparisons. By the time the count reached 11, it was no longer coincidence. It was a shadow stretching backward through time, revealing how methodical the family had been. These weren't crimes of opportunity. They were calculated vanishings designed to blend into the chaos of frontier life. And that is the most chilling part. None of the 11 left behind for violence. No screams recorded. No witnesses. No graves marked. Just empty destinations and unanswered questions. The family didn't just kill travelers. They erased them so completely that the world barely noticed they were gone at all. Trust was the sharpest weapon the family ever used, and they wielded it with precision. They never forced their way into a traveler's life, they invited them in. Every gesture was designed to lower defenses. Warm greetings, sympathetic nods, shared complaints about the road ahead. They spoke the language of hardship fluently, because hardship was something every traveler understood. When someone feels understood, they stop being cautious. The family knew exactly how to read people. They could tell who was desperate, who was lonely, who was too tired to argue. A traveler arriving hungry and cold was already halfway surrendered. Offering food wasn't just kindness, it was leverage. Once a person ate at their table, slept under their roof, accepted their help, an invisible bond formed. Gratitude replaced suspicion. Politeness overruled instinct. It felt wrong to doubt people who had just fed you. Conversation played a critical role. The family asked harmless questions. Where are you headed? How long have you been traveling? Are you alone? To a guest, it sounded like small talk. In reality, it was assessment. Every answer helped them measure risk. A lone traveler with no close ties. Easier. Someone expected somewhere soon. More caution required. Trust flowed in one direction only, but the traveler never realized it. They also used routine to disarm fear. Supper at the same time. The same chair offered. The same reassuring phrases spoken to different guests. Predictability creates safety in the human mind. When nothing feels chaotic, danger seems unlikely. The family turned their home into a stage where normalcy was the performance, and the traveler was encouraged to relax into it. Even moments of unease were managed carefully. If a guest hesitated or sensed something off, reassurance came immediately, laughter, self-deprecating jokes, explanations blamed on mountain life. We do things different up here. That phrase alone erased countless doubts. People are quick to excuse odd behavior when they believe culture or isolation explains it. What made this manipulation especially cruel was that it preyed on human decency. Travelers didn't want to be rude. They didn't want to accuse kind hosts of dark intentions without proof. The family counted on that moral hesitation. By the time a guest realized their trust had been misplaced, the power dynamic had already shifted. The house was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. In the end, no chains were needed at first. No threats. No visible violence. Just a slow, deliberate stripping away of control, wrapped in smiles and hospitality. Trust wasn't broken, it was harvested. And once it had served its purpose, the traveler's belief in human kindness became the very thing that sealed their fate. Behind the friendly rooms guests were allowed to see, the house held spaces never meant for visitors, areas deliberately hidden, dismissed, or disguised as ordinary parts of an old mountain home. To a traveler, the layout felt a little strange but not alarming. Old houses often are. Floors creaked, doors stuck. Some rooms were said to be storage, others off-limits for practical reasons. In isolated places, people accept these explanations without challenge. The hidden rooms were placed where curiosity rarely lingered. A narrow door behind a hanging coat. A cellar entrance covered by stacked crates. A back room accessible only through another room, creating a natural barrier. These weren't secret passages in the dramatic sense. They were functional spaces made invisible through familiarity. When something is treated as unimportant, people stop noticing it. Sound control mattered. Thick timber walls and heavy furniture dulled noise. The house sat far enough from the road that even raised voices dissolved into the forest. At night, the natural sounds of the Ozarks, wind, insects, distant animals, created a constant cover. Any strange noise could be blamed on the land itself. Travelers, unfamiliar with the area, assumed the house was simply reacting to its environment. Light was controlled as well. Lamps were kept low. Certain areas were always dim. Darkness hides detail and shortens attention spans. A guest might glimpse a shadowed doorway or a staircase leading somewhere unexpected, but fatigue encouraged them not to investigate. The family guided movement subtly, steering guests away from places that raised questions and towards spaces that felt safe and warm. The most unsettling detail, revealed only much later, was how normal these rooms appeared once discovered. No obvious signs of violence at first glance. No theatrical cruelty on display. Just spaces used repeatedly for a single purpose, cleaned and reset like any other work area. That repetition stripped the acts committed there of emotion for the family. Horror became routine, and routine leaves fewer traces. Neighbors who eventually entered the house after suspicion arose described an overwhelming feeling, not of shock, but of realization. They had walked past this place for years. They had spoken to the people who lived there. And all the while, entire parts of the house had existed beyond their understanding, quietly serving a role no one wanted to imagine. The hidden rooms were not just physical spaces, they were symbols of how the family operated. What mattered was never shown. What was shown was never questioned. And within those unseen walls, travelers learned too late that the house had always been larger, darker, and far more intentional than it appeared from the porch. Long before the truth surfaced, the Ozarks whispered about the family, but whispers are easy to ignore when they come wrapped in superstition. Locals spoke in half sentences and uneasy jokes. Someone mentioned strange sounds at night. Someone else said travelers went in and were never seen again. But in a region shaped by folklore and isolation, such talk blended seamlessly into the background noise of mountain life. The Ozarks have always carried a reputation for the unexplained. Stories of spirits, curses, and bad land were passed down alongside practical warnings about weather and wildlife. When something felt wrong, people didn't immediately think of crime. They thought of the mountains themselves. A scream could be a fox. A shadow could be a trick of moonlight. Disappearances were blamed on the wild before they were blamed on people. The family benefited enormously from this mindset. Any odd behavior was dismissed as how mountain folk are. Quietness became shyness. Secrecy became privacy. Hostility became caution toward outsiders. When neighbors noticed wagons stopping more often than leaving, they assumed travelers changed routes or moved on quietly. Questioning another family's business in such a place was seen as dangerous, even disrespectful. There were moments when concern almost surfaced. A local might say, "Ain't it strange how many folks stop there?" Another would answer, "Strange things happen in these hills." And that was the end of it. Superstition acted like a curtain, allowing real danger to hide behind imagined ones. People feared ghosts more than neighbors. Even lawmen were not immune to this thinking. Sparse resources, vast territory, and countless plausible explanations made investigation feel unnecessary. Without bodies or witnesses, rumors stayed rumors. The Ozarks had taught everyone the same lesson: don't go looking for trouble, because trouble looks back. Over time, the whispers lost urgency. Repetition dulls alarm. When something is said often without consequence, it becomes background. The family faded into the category of odd but harmless, the most dangerous label of all. Harmless people are never watched closely. When the truth finally began to emerge, those old rumors took on a new weight. Every dismissed comment, every uneasy joke, every warning laughed away suddenly felt like a missed chance. The horror wasn't just what the family had done, it was how easily it had been explained away. In the Ozarks, superstition didn't just mask fear, it buried it alive. In the end, it wasn't courage or careful investigation that broke the family's silence. It was a mistake, a small one. The kind no one notices at first, but that begins to unravel everything once the thread is pulled. After years of precision and patience, the family grew too comfortable. Routine breeds confidence, and confidence breeds carelessness. The mistake came in the form of inconsistency. A traveler who was expected somewhere soon. A name that didn't fade into the background of the road. Unlike others, this person had spoken openly about their destination, their timeline, and who was waiting for them. When they failed to arrive, questions didn't drift. They followed. Someone came looking with purpose, not just hope. Then there was the physical error. An item that should have disappeared but didn't. A possession recognized later in the wrong place. A detail remembered too clearly to dismiss. For the first time, the house wasn't just part of a story, it was part of an answer. That single oversight did what years of rumors could not. It anchored suspicion to a location. Pressure changed everything. The family's calm routine began to fracture. Neighbors noticed tension. Movements became hurried. The patterns shifted. People who live quietly can still be observed when something is off. Silence, once natural, started to feel defensive. And defensiveness invites attention. When lawmen finally took a closer look, they weren't chasing legends anymore, they were following contradictions. Stories didn't line up. Timelines bent. Simple questions were answered too carefully. The house, once open and welcoming, suddenly felt closed. That change spoke louder than any accusation. The most haunting part is how close the family came to continuing forever. One fewer question. One better decision. One item destroyed at the right moment, and the trail might have gone cold again. That is how thin the line was between discovery and total erasure. The silence didn't shatter all at once. It cracked, slowly, audibly, and once that first fracture appeared, everything the family had built on secrecy began to collapse under its own weight. The house had swallowed by many voices, but it only took one mistake to make it speak. When evidence finally began to surface, it was like a slow, reluctant tide, revealing the horrors long buried. The items left behind, letters, journals, travel permits, personal belongings, formed fragments of lives that had once moved freely along the Ozark roads. None of it was dramatic at first glance. A missing shoe, a folded piece of paper with a hurried note, a wagon wheel abandoned in mud, but collectively, these fragments pointed to a disturbing pattern. Law enforcement faced a challenge unlike any routine investigation. The Ozarks' terrain made travel difficult, and witnesses were scarce. Locals were reluctant to talk, bound by habit, fear, or disbelief. And the family had been careful, meticulous even, in covering their tracks. Crime scenes were erased, possessions shuffled, and rooms cleaned. For years, each disappearance was treated as isolated, leaving investigators with pieces that seemed unrelated. The turning point came when someone noticed inconsistencies in the story of the travelers. A letter arrived from a family member, worried that their relative had vanished. Another neighbor recalled seeing someone enter the homestead with personal goods that were never seen again. Slowly, patterns emerged: 11 travelers, all last seen near the same homestead, all failing to reach their next destination. The evidence that had been invisible for years finally connected, revealing deliberate acts behind the natural chaos of frontier life. Even the physical evidence told a story. Hidden compartments in the house, once overlooked, contained belongings, scraps of personal items, and subtle signs of struggle. Nothing was overtly violent, but the arrangement and repetition of these traces implied systematic control and concealment. Every small discovery reinforced what investigators had only begun to suspect, that these were not random disappearances. The family's hand was in each case. Digital reconstruction, later testimonies, and court records pieced together the movements of both the victims and the family. Investigators mapped out who entered and never left, where items were found, and how the house's layout facilitated secrecy. Each finding, no matter how minor, illuminated the methodical nature of the crimes. The evidence wasn't just about proving guilt. It was about understanding how a place could be so ordinary on the surface while hiding such extraordinary darkness. Ultimately, the evidence served as a bridge between rumor and reality. It confirmed what whispers and intuition had long suggested, providing a foundation for justice that had been denied for too long. And in revealing the truth, it also exposed the unsettling reality that careful planning and exploitation of trust can allow evil to remain unseen, sometimes for decades, in plain sight. When lawmen finally confronted the Ozark homestead, they were unprepared for the scale of what they would find. These were officers trained to investigate theft, assault, and occasional murders, but the methodical cruelty of this family went beyond anything they had encountered. The investigation quickly became as much about understanding human psychology as gathering physical evidence. Every room, hallway, and hidden compartment demanded scrutiny, and every question revealed the unnerving intelligence behind the family's operations. The first challenge was access. The house had been built to obscure movement. Doors that seemed ordinary led nowhere. Floors and walls masked hidden compartments. Lawmen had to tread carefully, documenting each discovery, while piecing together how travelers could disappear without leaving obvious signs. What initially looked like a simple rural dwelling was in fact a labyrinth designed for concealment, and navigating it required patience and careful observation. Then came the testimonies. Neighbors, reluctant at first, began recounting long-held suspicions, stories of travelers who never reached their destinations, of sounds heard in the night, of subtle signs that something was wrong. Each narrative overlapped with others, slowly revealing a pattern. Even seasoned officers were struck by how consistently the family exploited both the terrain and human psychology. Isolation, trust, and fatigue were all tools in their arsenal. Physical evidence, once found, added a grim clarity. Personal belongings, hidden away, indicated that travelers had been brought into the house and never allowed to leave. The way the items were organized suggested systematic control, careful handling, and repeated practice. It was not an act of passion or rage. It was calculated, cold, and precise. Officers realized they were not just uncovering crimes, they were observing a carefully orchestrated operation honed over years. The emotional toll on the investigators was immense, seeing how ordinary the family had appeared to the outside world, how easily they had manipulated trust, and how nearly invisible the disappearances had been. Challenged their assumptions about human nature. They were forced to confront that evil can be methodical, silent, and devastatingly effective when hidden beneath the veneer of normalcy. As the investigation progressed, lawmen mapped the movements of victims, pieced together timelines, and reconstructed the house's secret spaces. They interviewed anyone connected to the family, slowly unraveling decades of deception. Every step was painstaking, requiring both meticulous record keeping and an understanding of the psychological manipulation the family had mastered. Ultimately, law enforcement's confrontation with the family exposed not only the crimes, but also the terrifying lesson of how ordinary life can mask extraordinary horror. What began as a missing traveler's case became a study in human cunning, patience, and cruelty, leaving officers and anyone who learns of it haunted by the realization that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are those who wear the mask of a simple, hospitable family. Even after arrests and confessions, countless questions lingered, leaving the story incomplete and chilling. The unanswered questions surrounding the Ozark family's crimes were perhaps the most haunting element of all. Investigators, journalists, and locals tried to piece together the fates of all 11 travelers, but gaps remained. Who had noticed them first? Were there more victims never accounted for? How much of the family's activity went completely unnoticed for years? These gaps gnawed at everyone involved. Because the full scope of horror may never be known, some questions revolved around motive. Why did a family in isolation, with apparent stability and basic necessities, feel compelled to prey on strangers? Psychological analysis suggested a mix of learned behavior, greed, control, and perhaps a deep sense of entitlement, but no explanation fully captured the cold efficiency with which they operated. Their methodical approach implied more than impulse. It suggested planning and ideology, a disturbing blend of pragmatism and cruelty that defied easy understanding. Geography played a role in these unanswered questions. The Ozarks are vast, rugged, and sparsely populated. Trails twist unpredictably, and forests conceal almost anything. How many travelers passed nearby and escaped suspicion simply because of the terrain? How many possessions, letters, or signs were washed away by weather, buried, or hidden in forgotten corners of the homestead? Every unanswered question was amplified by the landscape itself, leaving gaps that no investigator could entirely fill. Another layer of mystery involved the family's network, or lack thereof. Did anyone else know or assist? Were there accomplices beyond the immediate household, or did the family operate entirely alone? Court records and testimonies provided partial insight, but inconsistencies in statements left lingering doubts. The more authorities uncovered, the more they realized that silence and fear had been cultivated not only in the house, but across the surrounding community. Perhaps most haunting were the human stories that remained unresolved. Families of the missing travelers never received full closure. Some relatives never learned the ultimate fate of their loved ones. Names remain on old letters and travel permits, frozen in time, a testament to lives abruptly erased. These gaps underscore that while criminal justice can hold perpetrators accountable, it cannot restore what was lost or answer every lingering what if. These unanswered questions continue to fuel fascination and fear. They remind us that some horrors resist full understanding, that human cruelty can leave echoes long after the perpetrators are gone, and that certain places, like the Ozark family's house, remain marked by absence as much as by action. The story is complete in some ways, but incomplete in ways that ensure it will linger in the imagination, long after the lights go out. The final keynote, the question of why some places should never be revisited, resonates with a profound sense of unease. The Ozark family's house of death is more than a historical location. It is a symbol of hidden horror, a physical reminder that evil can flourish under the guise of normalcy. Even decades later, standing near the homestead or walking its surrounding trails carries a psychological weight that is difficult to describe. Visitors report a lingering sense of dread, as if the land itself remembers the crimes committed upon it. Part of the fear stems from isolation. The Ozarks' dense forests and rugged terrain create natural barriers, but they also amplify feelings of vulnerability. Humans are wired to feel discomfort in spaces where visibility is limited and escape is difficult. The homestead exploited this instinct when it was active, and even after its exposure, the same geographic factors make it unnerving to approach. Modern exploration cannot erase the echoes of past violence embedded in the landscape. There is also the legacy of knowledge. When a place is revealed as a site of extreme wrongdoing, our perception changes permanently. Simple elements, a porch, a window, a worn path, take on sinister significance. Stories, photos, and investigations cannot fully communicate the sense of foreboding that the location itself evokes. Returning or attempting to experience the site risks trivializing trauma and ignoring the profound suffering that occurred there. The homestead's continued notoriety also raises ethical questions. Some people are drawn by curiosity or thrill-seeking, but engaging with a site of real human loss can cross into exploitation. The lives of the 11 travelers and the psychological manipulation that occurred within those walls demand respect rather than voyeurism. Revisiting such places without context or purpose risks diminishing the gravity of the events. Finally, the story serves as a warning. Not every dangerous place is marked. Some threats lie hidden behind ordinary facades. The Ozark House teaches that caution, awareness, and respect for history are essential when navigating unfamiliar spaces. Certain locations, though accessible, should be approached only with knowledge, reverence, and a full understanding of the darkness that once thrived there. In the end, the message is clear: some places are haunted not by ghosts, but by memory. The Ozark family's homestead remains etched in history because of what occurred there, and it continues to warn us that human evil can hide behind hospitality, normalcy, and smiles. Returning to such spaces invites not adventure, but confrontation with the darkest parts of human nature, and that is a risk few should take lightly.